First of all, thank you again for
Yes, sir.
doing
Thank
this. We've given you probably the most challenging assignment in some ways because we're asking you to speak as a lawyer, speak as a church leader, and speak as a lawyer who has defended people who come forward, but also speak as a lawyer who would also be aware of what institutional sensitivities would be. So I've turned you into schizophrenic.
I'm happy to try to do it all.
Okay, all right. So let me start off with this question, and that is, I think if I'm hearing your presentation correctly, you're saying something like, there could well be times when the institution's integrity is so at stake, they're going to have to be in a position to refuse legal advice. Am I hearing that?
100%. I think we have to understand very well in the church what all of our jobs are. So as outside legal counsel, when you come in, that's what I do for a living. It's very easy to project to the client, this is what you need to do to protect yourself. And then the church, the organization itself, needs to decide, is that the right thing to do biblically? And is it the right thing for our church and the people involved?
Okay, that was such a wonderfully short answer. I'm in shock. So let me follow it up this way, because obviously what that puts the institution in the position of being is they can make a decision to defend their staff member, or they can make a decision. I'm going to pose it this way on purpose, or they can make a decision to do the right thing. And so that raises a question, which is a legal question, and that is there a way to protect the organization from the act of a single individual that's a part of their organization? That's the first part of the question. Let me give you the second part. Second part is, when does an organization get itself into more trouble, okay, beyond the act of that individual?
Yeah, that's a great question. Let me try to take the first part of that first. So I want to propose that there's a middle ground between defending the staff member and defending the person who's made the allegation, okay? I'll give you a little bit of inside baseball, specifically on as it relates to employment practices with the scenario that I had. So you have a pastor who has made a claim, or you have a victim who has made a claim and is employed at the church, and you have the pastor. You love both of them. What do? Well, a lot of times outside counsel will suggest, well, let me go out and hire an investigator to investigate this situation. Well, a lot of times those are, and I'm sorry to tell you this, those are predetermined results. Your outside counsel is going out to find somebody who's going to help you come to the conclusion your pastor didn't do anything wrong. That's truth. I'm a lawyer. I've seen it many times. So you as a church have to make a determination. Do we really want to know what happened? Or do we want to protect the entity and its potential liability? Maybe those things are not mutually exclusive. Maybe they are. But you need to have a real outside independent investigator. I know Grace conducts that type of work. And there are many competent investigators to find out what actually happened. And I think as a church, or as a church leadership body, that's the thing that you want to know. You've got to get to that core issue. What actually happened here? And the second part of your question was?
Well, the first part of my question is, I'm not sure that entirely gets at. Is there a way for the institution to separate itself from the action of someone who's a part of their staff? Is there any way to build any kind of a wall between let's say it's a pastor or an associate pastor, it doesn't make any difference what position they are, but they're hired by your organization, and they have individual responsibility at one level for their actions. And then the second part of the question was, when does the institution come to be at fault?
That's great. So let me try to answer that as precisely as I can. So there are a lot of different types of acts that the church itself owns the conduct of its employees, okay? Violative acts of abuse by someone who's a senior pastor who has the ability to hire and fire. Now, if you had somebody who is working in kids ministry and on a Saturday night goes and gets drunk and does something horrible, the church is not responsible for that conduct. But when the church has people in leadership who are responsible for bad conduct, you own them. You own what they did. And you as a church need to respond as if you own what they did, rather than trying to create distance. Now, another circumstance is when the church is aware that an individual employee or staff member is a problem. For example, there have been a number of situations where staff said, he made me uncomfortable, there were sexual advances here. We've got repeated conduct or history of repeated conduct, and the organization doesn't respond in a meaningful way. That's when your liability potentially explodes. And then what can you do after it to make it worse? Retaliate against the victim or the woman and say, oh, I'm sorry, you can't go to church here. Or speak about them badly publicly. It's that it's those retaliative actions that end up escalating the liability of the church.
Okay, so let's take Scott's earlier declaration that there's the abuse itself, and then there is the fallout that comes from how you respond to the abuse. And I made the point earlier, you either cut it off at the point at which you become aware of it, or you can perpetuate it, depending on what you do. I take it that the situations that I'm aware of where this happens, that one way an institution will characteristically respond is to put someone on administrative leave.
Sure.
I take it that from a legal point of view, that is a very responsible act while the institution is determining what actually happened.
I think it's critical, not only for protection from future liability. So just imagine the situation that Vonner proposed earlier. If the church leader, that I'm not talking about, if the church leader had been placed on administrative leave, how would the church have responded to future actions by that same leader? I think it's important to take them off the playing field so that everybody knows there's a potential problem here and the church responds in a meaningful way instead of simply sweeping it under the rug. And then
go ahead.
Yeah, I think having placed someone on administrative leave it's an important first measure to take that person off of the field and then be able to communicate to your body what you've done and why.
Okay, now, in the scenario that you had, you gave us so many different constituencies that you have to be concerned about simultaneously.
Absolutely.
That my hairline makes total sense. So,
100%. I've lost a lot of hair in the last year, Doc.
So, but let me deal with another reality that people often deal with, because you dealt with the issue of reputation and what comes on, and of course, one of the things that happens when something like this happens is that you do not have control over what takes place. That's the reality.
It's unmanaged chaos.
Okay.
Right.
So that's an interesting combination of words. And what inevitably happens, I think, is when you try and communicate something as a board, even if it is communicated in total good faith, there are gaps in what people know. And human beings have this very rare ability to fill in gaps. And the gaps that they fill in, this may fuel one of the fears that you talked about. That what I say about the church grapevine is it's as fast as the omniscience of God, just not as accurate. Okay. Which is a problem.
Sure.
So obviously that's one of the things that people do get concerned about. So let's talk about that dilemma, because there's no way to control it, right?
Sure. Well, I think what we're experiencing as an evangelical church, so the church in my example had 3,000 members. Mm-hmm. I think what we're experiencing in the church is, in a church where, let's say that the right side of the auditorium is a church, it's those 50 people. If there were a situation like the one I described in a church of 50 people, I go to Mike and I go to Susan and I have individual conversations with them and give them an opportunity to ask questions. The larger a church gets, the harder that communication task is. Mm-hmm. And so you try to communicate globally to thousands of people who now have way more questions than when you started. And in order to have a fulsome communication, you've got to be talking one-on-one and give people an opportunity to ask questions. This mass-produced, mass-communicated church creates problems in responding to abuse that you're already identifying. How do I fill in gaps for people? You can't.
You can't. That's the problem.
Unless you have a one-on-one conversation with
Right.
somebody about it.
Yeah. All I'm doing is sharing what's core communication theory, which is that when you communicate something, there's what you intend to communicate, and then there are the consequences that come along with it,
Sure.
over which you have absolutely no control.
That's right.
And so, so that becomes a real dilemma. At the core of what you are saying, I am hearing this. If the church tries to move away from doing the right thing, the worse it gets.
Yeah, so we have the classic test case from what the Dyers experienced at that particular church. Had there been an atonement, an immediate atonement, where the church leader is held responsible and the church board acknowledges what happened and follows 1 Timothy 5, explains to the body what happened, and has a complete disclosure of the entire situation, do they end up losing financial resources and people and staff in the same way? I don't think they do. I think people in the church and most people here are understanding that people sin. Mm-hmm. It compounds the problem and erodes trust in leadership when there is sin, and then people say that wasn't sin, or you don't necessarily know it was sin. That makes things much worse. At least that's my observation.
Okay, now I'm gonna totally flip on you.
Okay, great.
Okay, because we've spent 2 hours with a huge assumption, which has terrific statistical support.
Yes, sir.
That is that when the woman comes forward, the odds are absolutely excellent, better than any politician's numbers ever have, that there's a reason she's coming forward.
Yes, sir.
How do you protect the accused in those situations where that is not the case?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think you're scratching at the tension that church leaders feel when this particular issue arises. We have a loved leader, we have a loved victim. How do we balance any potential harms that might come to either one of them? Not knowing the truth of what happened, right? So here's how I tell people in our church, and I hope you will tell people in your church to respond to that issue. I am not in charge of adjudicating fault on the part of anyone in the situation. I'm not going to tell the person who is the leader, I investigated and I decided like a judge that what you did was wrong. We're going to take in information. We're going to seek outside help from maybe outside legal counsel, accountants. Or if there's a financial accounting issue that's involved, we might seek outside investigators like Grace, and we're going to get to the truth of what happened. And in order to protect both sides, we as a church don't reach a conclusion until we have all the information. I think it's the early deciding about what happened that creates the pain. For example, with a church saying, there's nothing to this when a woman comes forward, or a church saying, this 100% happened when you haven't done the investigation yet. I think particularly in the Willow Creek situation, what the women who were involved had asked for years was an investigation, an external investigation to be done. They weren't asking for a public lynching of a leader of a church. They wanted to get to the truth. And so I think that is our job as church leaders, to get to the truth, not necessarily to protect anybody's given reputation, but to get to the truth.
Okay, so let me tell you what I think this means for the term administrative leave and the communication that comes with it. And you tell me whether I'm right or wrong. When a church says we've put someone on administrative leave, that is not a statement of guilt or innocence. It is simply a statement of, we have to take a look at this and take a serious look at it.
100%. And I think that's part of your communication challenge as a leadership board, is to communicate to your body, we're not adjudicating fault on anybody's part yet, but we're putting this person on administrative leave because hey, there's been an allegation. So we haven't made a decision about that yet.
Okay, let me ask you one other question. And you probably have already alluded to this, but this gives you a chance to kind of tie it together for us. What would you say are the 2 or 3 core action steps that a person can take to handle the legal dimension of this situation in a godly manner? That's a little more specific question. In other words, how should the board cope with the legal pressure, especially if we assume where we started, which is there may be times when the church has to take legal advice that might be good legal advice from a lawyerly standpoint, but may not be the best advice for the institution in terms of how they handle the problem.
Okay. So if I understand your question, I think the first step that you should take is retain outside counsel from someone competent. Usually if there's an insurable claim, if it's related to employment practices, the acts or omissions of someone who's responsible for the church, insurance will appoint a lawyer for you, or they might pay for outside counsel. You need to retain someone who's competent and who you have confidence in. And then my next suggestion would be to take things slowly. A lot of times, a plaintiff lawyer who's representing someone who has a claim will come at you guns blazing, hot and heavy, and try to force the issue or make things go faster. Take things slowly. Be contemplative. Does the advice that I'm receiving, does it comport with what I believe Scripture is telling us as an organization to do? And then you've got to act. And I think I addressed this in my talk a little bit. What if you have a board of 10 members and 3 of them are best friends with a pastor and they're saying, we shouldn't do what you're telling us to do, or they're suggesting a course of action that benefits the pastor over the victim? As a church, as a leadership group, you've got to make a decision. It's not necessarily always going to be the right decision. I've been a part of church board decisions that weren't the right decision before, but you have to act. One of the situations I've seen with other church boards responding to these issues is they say, well, we've got to act in unity. And for them, unity means unanimity. And so they're paralyzed by a lack of unanimity. They can't respond. So I think you got to hire somebody competent. You've got to take your time. You've got to decide, does this advice comport with what we believe Scripture tells us to do? And then you got to act. You got to make a decision.
Okay, now one of the reasons we wanted to do the conference, I'm addressing group here, is that we were hoping out of this conference that you would get things ahead of time before you walk into the situation that you think about and are aware of, rather than trying to make decisions on the fly while you're dealing with the situation, which is a horrible way to respond. And one of the things that we're hoping for is the things like the importance of administrative leave, how you communicate that, thinking through a board that might be used to dealing with unanimity in the senses that you're talking about, but in this situation that will not be the reality.
I think that is almost certainly not going to be the reality, at least from the situations that I've been exposed to. So you're going to have different voices in the room, different things that are pushing on your independence, that are pushing on financial concerns, that are pushing on reputational concerns. And unless the Holy Spirit does something really miraculous, which I would love for that to be the case in every situation, the board is not probably going to be unanimous. It certainly wasn't in Willow's situation.
So one of the things to think about as a takeaway is to think about what would your approach be if you know you have to act on the one hand, but the odds of your being unanimous about that action are likely not to be the case. Mm-hmm. Right?
Right. Be prepared for disagreement. And if you're prepared for disagreement ahead of time, you know you can anticipate it. And my philosophy is you need to err on the side of care. Mm-hmm. If you're going to err somewhere, you need to err on the side of care rather than protecting the nonprofit.
Okay, I've got a series of questions that have been typed in now. What are the situations where I, as a pastor, am required to report abuse, whether they want me to or not?
Great question. I hope that everyone is aware of this. But if you're not, as someone who is a pastor at a church, you are obligated by law. It is a crime not to do this. You are obligated by law to report any allegations of sexual abuse against a minor child. Okay, and most of you probably already know this. There's a hotline that I believe is maintained by CPS or DPS that you can call and make the report. And my philosophy with our staff is we err on the side of reporting. If you're not sure if a child was 18 or 18 in 3 days when something happened, you report it. And a lot of times, churches, they have that check where they go, I don't know if I should do this. And that's what predators are counting on. Predators are counting on your being nice. There is institutional niceness at church, which is great. We've got a lot of nice people in churches. But the problem is predators are counting on that, on your not reporting. My personal belief, and nobody is going to jail over this, but if you believe that sexual abuse has occurred on an adult in your church, you have an obligation to report that to the police as long as the person who is the victim is consenting to it. Okay? So when I shouldn't say obligation. My practice or our practice as a church is if someone reports an allegation of sexual abuse who is not a minor child, I ask them, I would like to call the police for you. Do you want me to do that? Sometimes they'll say no, sometimes they'll say yes. But I believe your obligations as far as pastors are to, every time there is a report on a minor child or involving a minor child, you've got to contact the number. Otherwise, you may be going to jail.
Okay, and just for clarity's sake, a minor is anyone under 18, is that correct?
Correct.
Okay. This is a variation of the question that was just asked. What responsibilities does a church or pastor have when you know a perpetrator, but the victim does not want to see the person or want any further actions taken?
Yeah, I think you have to, if there is an allegation involving, so this is a really complicated question. So you have a victim who has said, this perpetrator did this to me, but I don't want you to do anything. My bent as a church leader is to say, I don't really care what you want. I'll protect your anonymity, but if this person is a risk to someone else in our church, we're going to respond. So if it's someone who has abused another adult or abused a child and there's been an outcry from either an adult or a child and that person says, I don't want you to do anything, I'm sorry, you just lost the ability to govern that situation. I, as a church elder, am responsible to direct the affairs of the church, and so I'm going to do that. And if somebody says, I want anonymity, obviously we're going to preserve that. That's part of our job as a church, to preserve that anonymity. But we don't get to check off that box and say, I don't have to respond now. You do have to respond.
Okay, and I actually think you've raised something that's important for people to understand, which is that just because someone reports something and comes forward doesn't mean that the identity of the person who's the victim is necessarily going to go public. It might, but it doesn't, because there is this possibility of protecting identification. Is that correct?
100%. I've dealt with a claim of sexual abuse that related to someone at a church who didn't want their identity disclosed. They didn't want to be out there, but it was still a problem that required responding to. And so I think we have to respect the victim's desire for privacy if that's what they want.
Okay, I'm going to play off of a question, but I'm going to re-ask it in a slightly different way, because this is asking, would you recommend a church having written policies and procedures in place for how to address any future potential abuse? But I also think what I heard in your presentation is it might be helpful to have policy, but each situation is going to require its own discretion in thinking through what that means. So help me with that tension.
So as it relates to children, the Child Safekeeping Policy Guide is, in my view, the standard of care. I think every church needs to have child protection policies in place. If you don't have them today, you better have them tomorrow. You better walk out of here and get that problem figured out. Those policies have to be in place. Now, I think what I was trying to express earlier is if there's been an allegation of abuse, is there a policy manual that I, as an elder, am going to go, all right, let's turn to page 10. Here's how we address this issue. They're too complex. There's no way that a policy manual could embody how to respond to each situation. So what do we have to do? We have to look at what our standard of care is according to Scripture. We have to pray. We have to talk with one another. We have to consult our staff. There's not going to be any rote response where, okay, somebody's made an allegation of abuse, we do A, B, and C. It's every situation is different. Maybe the outcry is by a child. Maybe it's by an adult. Maybe it's a confession by someone who's a perpetrator. Every situation is responded to differently.
Okay, another question. What does a fairly small church do that can't afford an outside investigator?
Great question. I think so if we're talking about a small church where there's an allegation that's been made upon the pastor, I think as an elder board, you need to go out, you need to take that pastor, put him on administrative leave, and you need to gather as much information as you can. I think that's the economic reality of that.
Okay. Can you discuss the reality of a growing number of forced NDAs and legal threat letters sent to victims or whistleblowers?
Yeah, it's ugly. It's appalling. I think the larger a church gets, the more complex its HR department gets, or any organization. The more complex its HR department gets, the larger an organization gets, the more of that type of activity there's going to be. Saying, okay, we've got a staff person who's got a grievance. Here's a check, sign a non-disclosure agreement, say you're not going to disparage us. That is a practice that's very common in the corporate world. What is it doing in our church? I mean, in what scriptural value could that possibly support or substantiate? I think that with the church growth or the mega church growth explosion, some of the toxic things from corporate culture have been introduced kind of like a virus into that culture, and it's been given opportunity to grow, and to the point where it seems normal. I don't think those things have any place in our church. I understand not wanting to be disparaged. I understand not wanting dirty laundry aired, but I don't think they have any place in the church.
Okay, here's a little bit of a fill-in on an earlier question. Putting the accused leader on administrative leave doesn't seem neutral. How would a church communicate that to a congregation without giving the assumption of guilt?
Yeah, I think you need to explain why you did it. And first of all, I think you need to, as a leadership group, take the air out of that balloon and say, this is not an adjudication of guilt. We're trying to gather information. You need to say it just like that. Anytime there is someone in your church who is suspected of being a predator, you need to exclude them from your flock. At least until there's some adequate investigation or fact-finding that's conducted. Just imagine let's imagine it was in your church. Let's imagine it was your house. And you got 3 kids under the age of 12, and somebody thinks there might be someone who's a sexual predator who comes and goes from your house. Would you exclude him from your house? Of course you would, 100% of the time. We have to treat these people like they're our family, and they deserve and require protection. And so when there is, even when there's some measure of doubt, we've got to protect them.
Okay, so let's deal with the other end of the administrative leave. You do your investigation, and lo and behold, this happens to be one of those cases where the person making the accusation, there's doubt about the accusation that they brought forward.
Sure.
How do you do the restoration on the other end of the administrative leave?
Yeah, that's a great question. So if you brought them back from administrative leave, how would you restore them? I don't have a ready answer for that. I think you would have to, as a leadership body, communicate as one, get up in front of your body and say, look, we investigated, we found out that this was unwarranted for whatever reason. Share all the information, lay it out bare for them, and say, we believe that this person is qualified to be your pastor or be your leader. I think communication that is clear and fulsome that's the way to go in that situation.
Okay.
Otherwise, people are going to feel like you were hiding the ball.
Okay. Here's an interesting question. This is a very interesting question. Now, I'm going to make an assumption in this question. The question is it ever appropriate to put both parties on administrative leave. So let's assume this is an inter-staff situation. What do you do with administrative leave in that situation?
Yeah, I think there would be situations where it would be appropriate to put them both on administrative leave if there is, some form of consensual affair that has maybe taken place, or at least there are allegations of that. And I think you have the same communication problem with your body, saying, look, we put both parties on administrative leave, and here's why we did it. He said one thing, she said another. There may be situations where that's an appropriate response.
Okay, I have too much experience on a board. Let me ask you this question. How much do you say at the start?
To your body or to your staff?
To your body. To your
Okay.
body. Well, actually, both are fair questions. Thank you. To your staff and to your body. And do you say the same thing to both? That might actually be a variation of the question.
Yeah, I think you have to say the same thing to both, and
Okay.
here's why. You're never going to assume that your staff isn't going to talk to people in the body about what it's just true. Yeah, it's true. So I think you want to say the same thing to both. I think you have to. I think in the absence of other guidance, you need to disclose. I mean, these are people who are trusting you for spiritual guidance. They're counting on you to do the right thing, and so you need to tell them up front. Look, here's what's going on. Here's why these people are on leave. Here's who's going to be leading you in their
So
absence.
you say the accusation is X, okay? And we have put people on administrative leave to determine whether the accusation has merit or not.
I think that's appropriate, yeah.
Anything more? Or is that about all you
I
need
think
to
you
say?
tell them how the church is responding. The
Okay.
church is, if the church is conducting an outside investigation, tell them the church is conducting an outside investigation. If the church has hired legal counsel to outsource an investigation, tell them that. I think you've got to be able to communicate what is actually going on, make people feel involved and included.
Now, you also just shared an assumption that I think is true, that is another example of what you can't control, which is staff talking about whatever it is that gets communicated to
Yeah,
them.
sure.
I've been in board meetings in which the remark has been made, anything that we think will not go public probably at some point will go public.
Almost certainly.
Okay.
Yeah.
So even the attempts at protection usually doesn't work in the midst of the information gathering that goes on. General question, what advice do you have about that reality?
About staff potentially disclosing information?
Or about the fact that your ability to control what goes out is actually quite limited?
So I think the thing that you need to be on guard for as church leadership is making sure that your staff is not either suggesting the fault or guilt of anybody involved, and is not perpetuating someone's narrative from one side of the discussion or the other. I think that needs to be controlled from a discipline standpoint.
Okay, so what you say is, all right, we're putting people on administrative leave, and what you say to your staff is, we've told our body that we are not adjudicating this situation ourselves, which means you as a staff can't adjudicate it either.
That's right. Yeah. Nor should you try. And if you do try,
and if you're caught trying,
it's going to be a problem.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Okay. All right. Natural question. What about all male elder boards? Okay. Of which there might be a few. Okay. What provisions can be made to better accommodate female victims?
I feel like you're going to throw me out of this conference if I start talking about that. Okay.
I know what your
No, it's
first.
fair. It's fair.
Yeah.
All right. We're going to lay aside my personal viewpoints on this for a
Okay.
moment. Men do not see the issue with the same eyes that women do. Let me put it this way. If women are on your elder board, just as they were in Willow Creek's situation, it does not guarantee a good outcome, all right? But what will guarantee a bad outcome is not hearing the woman's perspective on what a woman who has brought a story forth is experiencing and how they're going to feel and be treated, okay? So for those of you who have all male elder boards, you need to have women's voices, eyes, and ears in the discussion with you, even if you don't think that they're qualified to lead with you. You need them there. They're essential to being able to process the information adequately.
Yeah, I mean,
Okay.
I'm one of the churches I'm connected with has an all-male elder board, but they have brought along a group of women who are highly respected in the body, who advise them across the board, but particularly on something like this, they would be available to do this, and that would be the way they would be set up to do it.
So psychologists have this thing called the Dunning-Kruger complex. Some of you have heard of it. It's people who are incompetent often think that they are competent. And people who really are competent actually think they're less competent than they are. It's called the Dunning-Kruger complex. So really, a lot of elder boards don't know what they don't know. And it's the way that God designed us, right? It's you don't know what you don't know. So find someone to get in the conversation with you who can tell you what you don't know and what you're missing.
Okay, another strictly legal question. What are the legal obligations to report if the victim and perpetrator are both minors?
That is a great question. So I just want to be clear for you, the law does not discriminate or distinguish between the outcry of a minor child against an adult or against a minor. Let me give you a situation that I was aware of, this before I was ever in church leadership, but where sister is saying that brother is molesting her, and they're both minor children. Sister makes an outcry to someone at a church. Your reporting obligation is the same. You must report it immediately, even if it involves a minor child. So the criminal statute does not distinguish the leader's obligation to report based upon the age of the assailant, if that makes sense.
Okay, it does.
Okay.
First, I'm going to actually ask the last question on my list.
Ooh.
Okay, what responsibility does the church leadership have to communicate the known presence of a person within the body who's been arrested for sexual abuse? And another question just came in. How broad is the circle? And to complicate the question, if the person is a minor and involved in youth groups.
Okay. Yeah, let me try to take that piece by piece.
Okay.
I think if you have someone in your body who's a known perpetrator, this may seem harsh, I think it's your obligation to exclude them from places where they can harm others. Okay? And that doesn't seem loving or nice, but I don't see being nice as part of my elder job. Just ask anybody else who's on the board with me. I love the people that we serve with, and I love the people in our body. But if someone looks at a decision that we made and said, hey, you excluded that person who has predatory sexual stuff in their background, that wasn't very nice, I'm going to go, I'm sorry. That's the decision that we made. I think we have to err on the side of protecting our flock, just generally speaking. So there was another portion of that. What if they're a minor?
Yeah. What if the person is a minor involved in youth groups?
It becomes even more challenging. And here's the discussion that'll go on in your staff. I mean, it probably has gone on your staff. If we exclude this person, they're not going to get to know Jesus. That's not your responsibility, okay? I know that we all here want everyone to come to a saving knowledge of Jesus, but when it's a situation where you're at risk of not protecting someone in your flock, you have to protect them. I think we put that obligation on ourselves, and predators know that you're going to do that too. You're not going to exclude me from this space. And so I think we actually do have to take the active measures of excluding people from spaces where they can create a danger to others.
Okay, last question. What qualifies as an accusation? Doesn't some discretion have to be used even to decide if a leave is warranted?
Yeah, what qualifies as an accusation? I think we as church leaders, our obligations are to have our eyes open and our ears open. When you hear something that sounds abusive, you need to ask meaningful questions, okay? Not every accusation starts with, so-and-so did so-and-so to me. It may start with, I saw Bob do this with Cindy and I got a bad feeling about it. And then now I've got to go and have a meaningful conversation with Cindy. And I've got to have a meaningful conversation with Bob. That's part of our job, to find out what's going on. So I don't think that accusations take any one form, like there's a formal demand letter or whatever where you say, Bob did this to me. It often takes many different forms. I think situations like the church the Dyers were involved in, where abuse was permitted to, I guess, grow, thrive. There were all kinds of little missteps along the way, where if somebody had a meaningful conversation or there was meaningful discipline that happened, there wouldn't have been so much carnage, so much destruction. So I think we as church leaders need to open our minds to what an accusation is. It's not always, this person did that to me. We need to be paying attention to what people are saying and listen to them.